All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. I think people will continue to trickle in and that's just fine. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Energy Burden in Virginia and Local Strategies for Affordability webinar, where we'll be digging into, Maria, if you want to go to the next slide, some of the energy burden studies that the Community Climate Collaborative has released over the last few years. I'm Carolyn Pugh. I'm the Director of Climate Policy, and we have here Maria Duster, our Climate Justice Policy Manager. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what our organization is, zoom out a bit, and just think through the Virginia energy landscape so that we have some context for what's going on more locally with energy burden. Dive into the meat of the studies, what we found, recommendations for what we can do about some of this locally, and then hopefully leave as much time as possible for Q&A at the very end. If you have questions come up during, feel free to just pop them in the chat, but we probably won't get to it till the end of the session because we have a lot of material to get through. Next slide. Okay, so Community Climate Collaborative, or C3 for short, for anyone who's not familiar, although I see a lot of familiar faces on here, which is great, nice to see you. We are a Virginia-based nonprofit working towards equitable climate action in Charlottesville and Richmond metro areas. And the way that we do that is by working on local policy and advocacy work, trying to change things at the local level, sometimes state level as well. It's all very related. Then we also do some work with the Green Business Alliance doing corporate sustainability and helping small businesses reduce their own emissions and costs, and also play more of a leadership role in the policy work. And then finally through youth leadership, and that looks like teen internships and activities in schools so that people can start getting involved younger and shaping important decisions for everyone's future. Okay, so the zoom out to Virginia energy landscape. Virginia is experiencing an affordability crisis when it comes to energy, when it comes to cost of living, just like the rest of the country. And for energy specifically, residential energy rates have increased quite a bit. They've gone up 20% statewide from 2021 to 2025. That's only expected to increase in future years. And part of what is driving that is this really sharp increase in demand from the commercial sector, including data centers. So Virginia has become a global hub for data center construction, and that leads to absolutely skyrocketing energy demand. So if you want to quickly flip to the next slide, I think this visual is really striking and informative. So it shows over time the difference between residential energy consumption and commercial. And you can see that in recent years, the commercial energy consumption has absolutely skyrocketed. And unfortunately, a lot of those costs of building out the infrastructure to serve all of that. And so that looks like building out new plants to provide that energy where it can be procured from, and also looks like building out transmission lines to feed that energy to these new hubs of consumption is being distributed across the state and across residents as well. And so if you flip back, that is part of what is driving these residential costs. And this blue line here that you're seeing is specific to Virginia residents. So that's not talking about any of the commercial work. All of this is being exacerbated by things happening at the federal level. So we've seen massive cuts to programs that specifically help low-income residents with their energy costs. We're also seeing cuts to renewable energy tax credits, so it makes it that much harder to build out clean, affordable energy to help meet this demand. And then on top of that, seeing cuts to environmental justice initiatives like Justice 40, because we know that all of this is deeply an equity issue as well. And then finally, again, on top of all of the rest of that, it's being aggravated by what we're here to talk about, which is global warming, extreme weather events increasing. So if you are experiencing a heat wave, you need to have more affordable energy to be able to keep your home comfortable and cool. And it just makes it even more of an urgent problem to address. So then zooming back down, what is energy burden and how does it relate to all of this state level work? Energy burden, it's a quantitative metric that helps us understand energy affordability and who it's affecting. And it's calculated as the percentage of a household's income that is spent on energy and utility costs. And so that includes electricity, natural gas, and other heating fluids. And if you're spending 6% or more of your income on those costs, it's considered a high energy burden. So why is this important? It helps us understand the financial impact of energy costs on people's lives. And that can be things like well-being and health. If your home is too cold in the winter, that could be a health crisis, especially for more vulnerable populations. It can force people to make trade-offs between bills and necessities. And that isn't captured perfectly in this metric because you aren't able to see what kind of trade-offs people are making. And to do that, you have to go look at energy insecurity. But the benefit of energy burden is it's more accessible data. You can get it from sources we are already doing without doing extensive survey efforts. So that's why the focus of these studies are actually on that quantitative energy burden metric. And then to supplement, we did a lot of qualitative work as well. You can flip to the next slide. Okay, and now I'm going to pass it off to Maria to get into the bulk of the actual studies that we've done and talk about the results that we found.
Hi, thank you so much, Carolyn. Hello, everybody. My name is Maria Duster. I work with Carolyn on our policy team here at C3, and I use she, they pronouns. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. So as Carolyn mentioned, I am going to hop into really the studies themselves, the findings, and our recommendations from them. So just for a quick overview, as of this summer, C3 has completed 3 comprehensive energy burden studies. The first was in 2020, and that study looked at the city of Charlottesville. And then the 2 recent studies, which we've done in the last year, are in Albemarle County. Albemarle County surrounds the city of Charlottesville, like literally surrounds it. So it's directly adjacent. And then the city of Richmond. And so some of the general aims of this research that are shared across all studies is to, of course, first map and understand energy burden. So understand which groups are being disproportionately impacted by high energy burden, and then look at the geographic distribution of that. But also to analyze some common drivers of energy burden. So those include things like whether or not someone rents or owns their home, the age of their building, the type of building they live in. So do they live in a single family home, an apartment building, a mobile home, et cetera, and income, among others, and how that relates to housing affordability. And so that's going to be a big theme in this too, is while we are looking at energy burden specifically in terms of this metric, it is very much connected to a larger conversation about housing affordability and housing security in these municipalities, which we'll dig into in a little bit. And then, of course, the last thing is, we want to be able to craft local contextual solutions based off these findings, based on what we know is available, programmatically, funding wise in these different municipalities, and to have solutions that we can put into effect that are going to improve people's quality of life, reduce their costs, and hopefully contribute to local climate goals by reducing emissions. So just general scope of research. So this is explained in full in our reports if you're really interested in kind of the nitty-gritty of the methodology. But we sourced our data from the Low Income Energy Affordability Data Tool. That's a federal Department of Energy database you can access online for free. And then we also pulled some data from the US Census, particularly the American Community Survey, and then also the Energy Information Administration, or EIA. Data is analyzed at the census tract level, so this is also pretty important. It's not citywide, it's not metro area wide, it's at the census tract level to give us a more granular idea of who and where is being impacted by energy burden. And then also, our research does not include entire metro areas, so it is limited to the city and county boundaries. A lot of existing energy burden research is looking at metro areas. So if you've read any, it's probably looking at like the entire Richmond metro area, for example. We are just looking at city and counties. Okay. So I wanted to just really briefly give an overview of some of the municipalities that we looked at. Folks here might be familiar with all or none. This is not meant to be an extensive summary of these places, but just some things we wanted to highlight as we're going into this discussion. So the first is the city of Charlottesville. Charlottesville has a population around 45,000 people. It is home to the University of Virginia, which means that it has a very large student population. That student population, mixed with growing unaffordability and a couple other factors, has led to it being a really tight housing market, which is something that is kind of shared across all of these places. And another important metric we want to introduce into this conversation is cost burden, which maybe some folks have heard about. So, cost burden refers to how much you're paying towards overall housing costs. And those overall costs include both like your rent or mortgage payment and your utility bills. And so, if you're 30% or more, if you're paying more 30% or more, then you're considered cost burden. So in Charlottesville, around 22% of homeowners and 36% of renters are cost burdened. The city of Richmond has around 230,000 people. Out of these three municipalities, it has the oldest housing stock by far. 30% of Richmond's housing stock was built before 1940, and around 70% of it was built before 1980. It also has the largest amount of low-income residents and people of color compared to these other municipalities. It is the most racially diverse. About 40% of Richmond's population is Black or African American, 10% Hispanic Latinx, and then 40% white. And then a quarter of homeowners are cost burdened, and a staggering 51% of renters in Richmond are cost burdened, underscoring again, this growing unaffordability that we've been referencing already. And then lastly is Albemarle County. Again, that surrounds the city of Charlottesville. It's the largest of these three municipalities. It has around 115,000 people. And something that's, I think, interesting about having Albemarle County included in this conversation is that, it's not a city, it's a county. And so there is this conversation about this, rural versus urban divide. The county is divided into rural and development areas, which impact what can be built and how easily things can be built. So 95% of the county is designated as rural, and then about 5% is development areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then 19% of homeowners are cost burden and 34% of renters. Okay, and so as we were starting this process and approaching this all, something that was important was really being able to understand what exists already in these three municipalities that is either, that is helping to people to reduce their costs, make their homes more energy efficient, and what gaps or lacks are there in these places. And so this chart has a lot of words on it. You do not need to read them all, but if you are someone who is interested in doing this type of research where you live or work, something that we would recommend as an organization is really taking stock of what's already in place. What mechanisms are there that might be helping or hurting people when it comes to assistance on their energy bills? What local investments are governments making into these types of programs? And so I'll just highlight a couple of things here. Importantly, all of these municipalities have made concrete climate action plans and goals, all of which directly reference, clean energy and energy efficiency as a strategy to meet those goals. Charlottesville and Albemarle, they share a municipal utility, and that utility does offer rebates and incentives to customers for energy efficiency technologies. But Richmond, I think very importantly, offers no utility rebates or incentives on anything. So Richmond Gas Works does not offer that. And then some other things you might think about are, is there localized funding from the city or county that is going towards, energy affordability programs? What's the zoning situation? Is the municipality making it easier to build more energy efficient housing, climate smart housing? And you might even explore things like affordability, housing affordability, land trusts or programs, et cetera. Okay, so let's dig into the findings. So we're going to start pretty high level, and there's a lot of content here. So just a reminder, there's even more in our reports. And if you have any questions about these findings, feel free to reach out to us directly. But we'll start with high level. So the number of households that are energy burdened. So I'm just going to go kind of in order. So in Charlottesville, we found that over 4,500 households, that's about 23% of all households, have a high energy burden. So that's 6% or more. And the majority of these burdened households have an energy burden of actually 10% or more. And this is a trend that continues across all of these places, meaning that people are not kind of on the cusp of energy burden. They're not just right at that 6%. Folks who are energy burdened tend to be like pretty energy burdened, right? Very deeply entrenched in unaffordable energy costs. In Charlottesville, low income residents have the highest average energy burden, so it's around 16%, while the city average is 2%. And the largest concentrations are in student dominated areas and then historically Black neighborhoods. In Richmond, over 28,000 households, nearly a third have a high energy burden. This was one of the most staggering numbers we came across by far. And of those, the vast majority have, again, that very high energy burden, 10% or more. Richmond is among the top cities in the United States when it comes to energy burden, specifically among low income households. And all households in Richmond that are energy burdened are low income, meaning that they make 0 to 80% AMI, area median income. And then the largest concentrations are in the East End and South Side. For folks unfamiliar with Richmond, these areas a lot of them are majority Black. There's a higher low income population in a lot of them. And a lot of these areas have been subject to redlining and other forms of historic disinvestment. Lastly, Albemarle, over 5,600 households, around 13% have a high energy burden. The majority of those households are low income. And a little bit differently to the two cities I just mentioned, there was more of a mixture in terms of the geographic distribution of energy burden. So it was not only in development areas, it was in both development and rural areas. So I want to start with some shared trends. There were actually quite a lot of shared trends across all of these. The first being, perhaps unsurprisingly, that income is the main determinant of vulnerability to energy burden, which makes sense. Energy burden, the metric itself, uses income. But across all studies, again, low-income households had the highest rates of energy burden, and energy burden generally decreased as income increased, underscoring that solutions to energy affordability also really involve seriously understanding and tackling poverty in these places. And then this chart right here shows, so we see the top bar is kind of the lowest income level, and then it rises. And then across the x-axis is energy burden. And so you can kind of just see that as income increases, energy burden tends to decrease. So this is another map that Carolyn created, or two maps. So the one on the left shows the concentration of low-income households in Richmond, with the darker blue representing, the highest concentration of low income. And then on the right, this is the concentration of energy burden households in Richmond, those with the high energy burden. I think these maps are pretty staggering side by side and really do demonstrate this clear link between income and energy burden. And kind of this area that I have my cursor on below the river, this is south side. Above the river over here, this is the east end. Two of the areas I mentioned as being particularly energy burdened. And then this is Charlottesville. I just want to make sure I, show some stuff from all of the studies. And this is newer data that we actually pulled on Charlottesville on the left here. Again, just showing that income, as income increases, energy burden tends to decrease. And over here is distribution of energy burden in Charlottesville. Different to the other maps, it's the lighter colors that are more energy burdened. And so we see that particularly around the University of Virginia, which is right here. For folks who don't know, we see that in the Venable, 10th and Page, Fifeville, Jefferson areas in particular. Okay, so I think I briefly touched on this, but something I really want to also make sure we talk about is when we were doing these studies, grounding them in their relationship, energy burden's relationship to histories and legacies of racism and discriminatory planning. So energy burden is not distributed evenly across areas. It is concentrated in many of the poorest, blackest, and underinvested neighborhoods in these municipalities. And it is historic practices such as redlining, segregatory zoning, racial covenants that have led to groups being actively disenfranchised. And so this not only kind of partially maybe explains disparities in energy burden, but it also touches on that, people's access to resources, their ability to build wealth over time, access to, better housing stock, and even vulnerability to climate change are all shaped by these processes. And so on the right here, we actually have a map that shows concentration of energy burden in Richmond, and then it's overlaid with redlining grades. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency in the early to mid 20th century, graded cities in the US, neighborhoods based on their perceived lending risk for kind of like loans on houses, for example. And so they literally had a grade system, A through D. And in the United States, the majority of areas that were given D, the worst grade, were majority Black, were majority poor, and home to other subjugated groups and immigrants. I think this is again a pretty striking map showing that it's not that redlining causes energy burden, but rather redlining and these other practices contributing to these disparities that we see. Energy burden not occurring randomly, but being a symptom of these processes. So another, I think, important shared trend to note is that, when we started this study, and we're looking at drivers like building type and building age, I at least kind of assumed that, building age, if you had an old building, it was probably going to have a higher chance of being energy burdened, right? It's going to have higher energy costs. But what we actually found is that building type, so again, the number of units in a building, has a much clearer impact on energy costs and burden than building age. So building age can still be very helpful, right? If you have a 80-year-old building, you do want to make sure it's likely that it needs some upgrades if you haven't gotten them already. And the cost to maintain homes, only grows over time. So that's still a very important metric to think about in these conversations. But in terms of what's actually potentially impacting energy costs, building type is much more helpful. So we found in our study, again, across all of the studies, that single family homes and mobile homes and trailers had the highest energy burden and costs. And that, anything denser than that, so 2 or more units up to 50 plus units, had lower energy burden and costs. And costs generally decreased as number of units increased. And so part of this, of course, is because of square footage. So an apartment building is likely to have less square footage than a single family detached home. And as a result, it would need less energy to heat or cool that space, which is going to have a direct impact on costs. But also, multi-unit buildings tend to be more energy efficient than single-family homes, especially detached ones, because they share walls with other units, meaning that they lose less energy, less heat, and they're better insulated, making the case that, multi-unit denser housing is actually a strategy for reducing energy costs, emissions, et cetera. But this next slide, there's a lot of graphs on here, I know, but this is kind of just digging a little bit more into the square footage question, right? Square footage varies a lot in residential buildings, but these blue circles at the top just show what I was just talking about, that single family homes tend to have this higher square footage than multi-unit properties. The second graph in the middle shows that average square footage has increased over time in Virginia. I know we kind of sometimes hear about everybody just keeps building bigger and bigger, and that is true. That is what's happening. But we also are seeing a higher proportion of multi-unit housing being built. So in Richmond, for example, the majority actually of housing built in the last 5 years has been multi-unit housing. But interestingly enough, as average square footage in homes has increased over time, energy consumption has not actually increased significantly, potentially pointing to other reasons that folks might be having higher energy costs, whether that's some of the issues Carolyn talked about right now with the market or the quality of housing stock, et cetera. Okay, so some differences and considerations, shifting a little bit. So first is digging into one of the drivers we looked at, which is home ownership. So this is whether or not someone rents or owns a home, and why this can be an important thing to talk about when we talk about energy burden is that, if you are a renter, I'm a renter, I do not have much control or capital over the type of heating or cooling system in my apartment building, right? I have an ancient radiator system that, the landlord is the person or the building owner is in charge of replacing if they want. And so again, this can impact energy costs depending on, what's available to you, if you're able to change your situation to change it to something more efficient or cost effective, just as one example. So we looked at home ownership. We were kind of curious whether or not, renters were more burdened than homeowners, or maybe the opposite. And here's what we found. So we found in Charlottesville that home ownership appeared to not really have a significant impact on energy burden. In Charlottesville, more renters are burdened than homeowners in terms of the number of households, but that's partly because Charlottesville is a majority renter city. But when it comes to the actual average energy burden that different income levels were experiencing, so we broke it down by income level, there weren't really large differences at all in Charlottesville. So the lowest income folks, for example, had the exact same energy burden rate. This was different though in Richmond. So in Richmond, similarly, more rental households were energy burdened than homeowners. Again, partly due to Richmond being a majority renter city, but also more low income people tending to be renters. But homeowners had a higher average energy burden. So again, that like actual percentage. And at every single income level, homeowners tended to be more energy burden, which is interesting. Part of that again could be because of square footage. They're going to have higher costs if they're heating or cooling a larger space. But also, brings up important questions about, is there an opportunity with homeowners in particular who have this power and control over, the energy system in their home? Is there opportunity there to target those groups and help them? And then lastly, in Albemarle, we found that more homeowners are energy burdened than renters, so different than the other two, but that homeowners had a higher average energy burden. And again, part of this is because Albemarle County, more than the others, it has its majority homeowners significantly. And so the results in Albemarle look quite a bit different than Charlottesville and Richmond because of that. And so these graphs on the right are just showing an example in Richmond of energy burden across income level and homeownership, and then energy costs on the bottom. And I think something I want to highlight here on this bottom right graph is you can see there's some different colors, and that corresponds to heating fuel type. So whatever the primary heating fuel type is in these households. And as you can see for, homeowners, a much larger chunk of that cost is being eaten up by gas, natural gas, and also what's described as other, but which usually refers to propane or heating oil. And this is something we found across all the studies, which is that, um, homeowners tended to have a lot of their energy costs eaten up by these other fuel types, pointing to perhaps kind of older heating systems that are really costly. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was the impact of students on results. And this is something we cover the most extensively in the Charlottesville report, if you're kind of interested in this in particular. But what we found in the Charlottesville and Albemarle studies is that, some of the highest concentrations of energy burden were in census tracts directly adjacent or at the University of Virginia. And so you can see on this map right here, for example, in Albemarle, these two kind of census tracts I'm circling with the cursor, 109.01 and zero point zero 0.04. These are directly adjacent to UVA. And then in Charlottesville, as I showed in one of the previous slides, a lot of the 47% of extremely high energy burden households live in student dominated tracts. And so this kind of adds a little bit of nuance to the conversation, right? Because students, we have no way of knowing how much students are truly burdened by energy burden. Part of this is because Students often receive perhaps some financial support from family members or guardians, or maybe from the institution that they're attending school at. And so, when a student says that they have, a very, very low income and then they report their bills, it can be hard for us to really gauge, are they paying that directly? So is this a fair kind of portrayal of how much this burdens them? Or are they receiving additional support that isn't captured by the data that we're using? And so this can potentially misrepresent the burden that these people face. But at the same time, especially in places like Charlottesville and Albemarle, many low to moderate income people still live in these areas. A lot of the neighborhoods that are at or near the University of Virginia have significant amounts of, low income people, people of color who are experiencing energy burden. And so for the sake of these studies, we do include all of this. Of course, with an asterisk that there are, a lot of students here, but we do not want to miss all of the folks who do live here who are being impacted by this, especially when in places like Charlottesville and Albemarle, a lot of these communities are being negatively impacted by the encroachment of UVA and rising housing and energy costs as a result. And then the last kind of difference or consideration I wanted to share with y'all is this question of kind of the rural versus urban trends in Albemarle. Uh, so this is a map of Albemarle on the right. And as I mentioned, Albemarle is split up into rural and development areas. The majority of the development areas are kind of directly around the city of Charlottesville. So with my cursor, this is gray kind of area on the map, that's Charlottesville. And then the development areas are around that. And then there's a couple of independent cities throughout the county. So when we were starting this study, I kind of assumed that most energy burden would be in the development areas because there was a higher amount of low income people in this area. It was more diverse. There were more renters. And that's what a lot of trends kind of pointed to. Um, but what we found is that, energy burden, yes, there is a lot of it in the development areas, but there's also a lot throughout the rural areas as well. And it's actually these two census tracts in the bottom of the county, the southern tip of the county, and then to the west. So this is kind of the Scottsville district for those who are familiar. And then this is the Samuel Miller district up here on the westernmost part of the county. These actually have like some of the highest concentrations of energy burden in the entire county, more than a lot of the development areas. And so I think this is a really great case study in terms of putting together all of these different factors that might be influencing these results. So the why. First of all, single family homes make up the vast majority of Albemarle County's housing stock. And then low income households are distributed, they're not just in development areas, they're distributed throughout the county. Albemarle County is kind of known as a fairly wealthy county, and that is true. But there are parts of the county that are much more low income than others. For example, the southern part of the county I just mentioned. And so as a result, if you have a lot of single family homes, which we kind of just talked about, how that leads to higher energy costs because of bigger square footage, and then you have a lot of low income people, dispersed throughout, then it makes sense that you're going to encounter energy burden kind of at a wider geographic distribution. The other thing I want to mention, and these also kind of go hand in hand, is that, we found that actually a lot of the oldest homes, in Albemarle County are not in the development areas. And this brings in this conversation about rural versus urban access to resources and funding. As I mentioned, building age alone cannot tell us if somebody is energy burdened. But again, if we know that there's a lot of aging homes in more rural parts of the county, and we're not sure whether or not people are getting adequate resources and funding for these areas, that again brings up questions about whether or not these folks are able to afford their energy bills. Okay, so that's a lot of the key findings from the quantitative side of the study. Now we're going to shift a little bit to the qualitative portion of the work that we did. So specifically for the Albemarle and Richmond reports, we sat down and interviewed a variety of organizations and local experts in the housing and energy spaces to learn about some of the issues that they're encountering in their work, what some of the clients or people that they serve are encountering, And what are some potential even solutions that that they would maybe suggest to make energy more affordable in these places as well as housing? Okay, again, there's a lot of text on this slide, but we broke it down into kind of four main areas. So the first is lack of affordability and then common issues people were facing. All of the organizations we spoke to talked about, again, increasing unaffordability as it relates to both energy and housing. In Richmond in particular, attorneys talked about, a lack of code enforcement and tenant protections. Uh, and then air conditioning, mold, and insulation were some of the key issues in RVA. Another thing I want to highlight is, we see energy and housing as very interrelated issues. And as we were doing this work, we were really trying to figure out all the links that we can make. And one of the attorneys we talked with, Legal Aid Justice Center, talked to us about multiple cases in which they've represented tenants who were being evicted due to unpaid utility bills. And so this is in cases where a tenant pays their landlord directly, their utilities, right? Some of us, we might pay the utility directly, or there's other schemes. But in these cases, it is legal for tenants to be evicted over these unpaid utility bills. And so this is a pretty striking example, I think, of this link, right? If you are energy insecure, if you're not able to afford your energy bills, in many cases, you might be vulnerable to eviction. And in a place like Richmond, which has the second highest eviction rate in the nation, this is a really serious issue. Um, Another thing that we heard, especially kind of in the Albemarle area, is that, people are willing to put up with subpar or poor housing conditions due to a tight housing market. There is not a lot of available and affordable housing stock in some of these areas. And so, again, thinking about trade-offs, people are more likely to kind of put up with subpar conditions if it's the only thing that they can afford. And this, of course, has implications for people's health and well-being. Some other kind of key areas we looked at, eligibility requirements. So that's at both the state and local level, and a lack of resources available to folks, whether that's bill assistance or rebates, et cetera. We also focused on mobile homes and trailers as well, and this is something we highlighted in particular in our Albemarle report. Um, and some things that we found, these are some of the most inefficient housing stock people can live in. Again, as I mentioned, we saw some of the highest rates of energy burden and high energy costs in these places. And they are often not even built for, the correct climate zone that Virginia is in. Again, underscoring that these are not safe or efficient places to live. And then lastly, one of the other key areas people spoke to was a lack of, funding or restrictive funding for energy efficiency work. And so funding, for weatherization, for example, is often only for specific types of repairs. So for service providers, many of whom we talk to who operate in these areas, it can be hard to kind of fully complete a job when the funding structure is really limited. So for example, they might be given some money to install a heat pump, but then if there's some additional work that has to be done around that to ensure that that installation is successful, they might not have the funds to do that. And so that often falls on the homeowner. Some other kind of restrictions in general might be that a lot of rebates or upgrades, funding for these things are only limited to homeowners. And so renters remain kind of largely unable to take advantage of these different programs. And so these are just a couple quotes. Again, the first one I think really speaks to this issue of trade-offs we've been talking about, right? So people having to figure out, do I pay my bill to keep the lights on? Do I pay my rent? I got to get my kid groceries or I have a doctor's appointment, right? These are all things people are having to negotiate day to day based on their energy bills and general living costs. Um, and then I think that last quote is pretty striking as well, which was, we would talk to Leap and Seville and Albemarle about mobile homes. And again, underscoring that, even the newest, like out of the factory homes are incredibly inefficient. And this is leading to these folks having, enormously high energy bills. Okay. So we talked through some of the quantitative findings, some of the qualitative findings, and now we want to get into the recommendations portion of this presentation. And so our recommendations were influenced not only by, of course, the data and the mapping that we did, but also by, what we heard from folks. I think that this type of study really exemplifies the very best of C3. We work locally, we have relationships with different organizations, decision makers, program managers in these spaces. And so I think marrying kind of this like higher expertise in, energy and climate with also this really like local contextual understanding. And so I'm sharing high level recommendations that in general can be applied to most of these municipalities. But if you're looking for more really specific recommendations for each one, those are included in the separate reports that are available on our website. Okay, so let's dig in. So the first is local funding for energy efficiency and weatherization. As we talked about, this is, federal programs for this type of work are being actively gutted at the federal level, which is then, of course, impacting state funding and state capacity to do this type of work. And so something we strongly recommend for municipalities is to try to establish a sustained multi-year pool of flexible funding that multiple service providers can tap into, and that specifically target energy burden and low-income households. Also important, at the same time, to make sure that we target the split incentive between renters and landlords. So, we talked a lot about homeowners, but we want to make sure we don't leave renters out of this conversation because they are often excluded from this conversation. And so, potential solutions to explore could be, expanding resources and programs that specifically target renters, perhaps establishing some type of incentive for landlords to actually do these upgrades, because right now they don't have much of an incentive to do that. Next is, of course, incentivizing local renewable energy. Again, this is something that is being, really severely hindered by recent federal action. But we know that solar energy is, the cheapest and most abundant energy that you can get right now. And so again, underscoring the need for, distributed and utility scale solar at the local level, but also making sure that we are incentivizing solar on these multi-unit buildings, making sure that renters can access this and other people living in affordable housing communities. And then, of course, investing in affordable housing. If we are saying that energy and housing costs are deeply related, then we know that investing in affordable housing for folks is a really key way to bring down costs in general. So that could look like, for example, supporting community-controlled options and preservation models, land trust, shared equity homeownership models, and then continuing to fund any existing affordable housing trust funds that exist, such as the one in Albemarle County. Richmond also has one, and making sure that we're focusing on preservation as much as we are new builds, so that folks can stay where they are and weather kind of these increasing costs. Mobile home repairs, again, another kind of key issue area. And I think that the way that we explain this to folks is a two-pronged approach. Right now, we know that these folks are some of the most energy burdened people in our communities, and they need help right now. They are living in unsafe living conditions a lot of the time that are inherently unsustainable. And so we need to figure out, what type of funding mechanism works to make sure that we get those repairs to those people. At the same time, municipalities should explore ownership models that, prevent exploitation and displacement of these people. For a lot of folks who live in mobile home parks, for example, they own the trailer they live in, but they don't own the land that that trailer sits on, which means that they are very vulnerable to displacement if a park owner decides to sell, for example. And so coming up with other ownership models, or practices such as, right of first refusal, can ensure that folks are not, being kind of cash cowed, so to speak, on these lands. Updating zoning laws. So another big thing, our study found that, denser housing reduces energy costs and is more energy efficient. And so as municipalities are considering updating their zoning codes, allowing for more mixed use, missing middle housing, and increased density is great. And making sure that, zoning changes, upzoning is applied equitably throughout these municipalities. And an example we have on the right, of course, is the Charlottesville zoning rewrite, which embodied a lot of these principles. And lastly, of course, again, tenant protections and resources. A lot of this is specific to the city of Richmond, but I would be really interested to explore with Albemarle in Charlottesville, what else can be put in place to make sure tenants in particular um, are being protected. And so in Richmond, for example, we recommended the establishment of a rental inspection program, making sure that code enforcement, offices are properly funded, and then creating an energy resource hub where folks can access, these resources. They can talk to someone directly, et cetera. Very akin to the one that recently was established in Charlottesville and Albemarle. So again, these are just the kind of high level recommendations that we put forward. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but I hope it does kind of illustrate to folks listening that this is really an issue that has to be approached from a lot of different ways. It's not just an energy issue, it's a housing issue, it's a tenants' rights issue, it's a zoning issue. And we wanted to make sure we underscored that with this research. So I am done. Thank you all so much for listening. And I think we will open it up to a Q&A if Carolyn and Leah want to hop back on with me.
And feel free to put it in the chat or just unmute yourself if you have any questions or thoughts on any of this.
I cannot see the chat, so if there's any interesting questions, let me know.
Oh, can I just ask, are there any next steps that you all are planning in these areas? Like what's your all next step?
Absolutely. So in Richmond specifically, actually, and Albemarle County are two places where we have some plans already. So as I think Maria mentioned, Richmond amongst the three categories has a little bit missing in terms of the local support for funding of energy efficiency programs. And so we are currently working on a resolution for city council to try to have them commit to designing and then funding a citywide energy efficiency program through the Office of Sustainability. And hopefully using that to kind of leverage additional state utility and federal funds more effectively through more flexible funding opportunities and working with local service providers who are already doing that work. So if anyone is in Richmond, please email us if you're curious about it. There's going to be opportunities to get involved with trying to get that off the ground in the coming month, really in the coming several weeks. And then in Albemarle County, I'm really excited to see that there was new funding just allocated to the AHP program. And that is something that is a program between LEAP and AHIP that works on both the housing repair and energy efficiency side, and is really awesome because it gets some funding from the city and the county as well. It's a really great program that was successful in the past, but then didn't get as much funding recently. So we're excited to see that. We think it could do a lot more if it was a continuous year-over-year commitment. And so that's something that we'll be pushing for this year as well.
Awesome. Thank you. That's exciting.
I had a question as well. So this was on one of your previous slides, but can you explain the difference between the high energy burden and then the average of high energy rates? There is some difference between renters and homeowners in Albemarle County, I think, in your findings.
Yeah, do you mean when you say high energy burden rates? I'm going to go back and see if I can find the slide. Um, this is Richmond. Is it a different slide, Lauren?
Let's see. Yes, it's that second bullet. Can you just explain that a little more?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So in the second bullet in Richmond, so more renters, so that means households, rental households are energy burdened than homeowners. So what that means is that the literal number of households with a high energy burden is larger in Richmond. But then when we're talking about average energy burden experienced by an income level, we found that homeowners had a higher average burden. So that's referring to the specific percentage of income on average that homeowners are spending versus renters. So while, again, more rental households are energy burdened, just in terms of pure numbers of households, the rate at which they are energy burdened, the percentage of their income they are spending, is actually higher for homeowners than renters. Does that
Oh,
make sense?
yeah. So the homeowners are proportionally paying more, even though there's more renters that are energy burdened. Okay, great. Thank you.
And then Leah and Carolyn, are there any questions in the chat that you think we should answer? I just can't see it. So.
Oh, no, but there's lots of thank yous. So thank you all for joining us.
Great. Any other questions from folks? We have just a few more minutes.
No questions, but I did just drop a link to the Energy Resource Hub for folks to check out so you can kind of explore the site and see what resources are available for you to use, especially if you live in the Albemarle and Charlottesville area. And then also momentarily, I'll be dropping a link to a list of resources that we also have on our site focused specifically on the Richmond area. And they are also available in Spanish as well on the initial page that we dropped just with all 3 studies, in case you would like to share with any community members who may prefer to use the Spanish version. But yeah, please do explore those.
Yes, no, thank you all so much for joining. And as I mentioned, all of the reports are available on our website. And if you have any specific questions, just feel free to email us, policy@theclimatecollaborative.org, and we're happy to chat more in depth about those.